Now, uh, of course, we were hoping to have Vanessa on with us last Wednesday, and we had a number of slides and topics to discuss about Syria, and we're going to talk about those today. We're going to start off with this because I got into a little bit of trouble last week by putting this on screen while Vanessa wasn't here, and of course she wasn't here to give the context of it, and so I hadn't appreciated or I'd forgotten that this particular photograph was not this from this year. It was actually from last year. But anyway, Vanessa, we want to start off with that correction in mind. We want to start off with this article from your website, The Wall Will Fall. The headline is Syria's children go to bed hungry because the US coalition is ensuring food insecurity. And you're commenting on this article from the Financial Times, which is headlined Syria's children go to bed hungry as prices soar. So give us your thoughts on this. What is going on with the burning of crops at the moment?
Well, I mean, to start with, this article is incredibly, I mean, it's criminally misleading. I read through the whole article. Not once does it mention, of course, the sanctions that have been imposed on Syria since 1979, ratcheting up along with the 10-year war that has been imposed upon them by the US coalition and their terrorist proxies, of course, for the last 10 years. But leading now, of course, there's been a sort of incremental increase in the pressure against the Syrian people during the war, but culminating in the Caesar law, which came into effect on June the 17th, on my birthday, unfortunately, which has effectively increased the pressure on all sectors in Syria, humanitarian, medical. There are pharmaceutical companies are now very short of supplies. Pharmacies are unable to provide the medicines that are required by people inside Syria. And of course, on top of that, what the US coalition has been trying to do, both last year, well, throughout the conflict, but last year and this year in particular, and this year we're seeing a huge number of fires in agricultural sectors that are either bordering areas still occupied by the various terrorist factions financed, armed, and equipped, of course, by the US coalition, including the UK, or actually occupied by the NATO terrorists. In the northeast and the northwest, of course, that comes under the banner of Turkish control. And what we're seeing are a huge number of fires, particularly in wheat and barley crops that have been deliberately started. In one area in Hasaka in the northeast, we believe, or it has been reported, that American helicopters actually dropped thermal balloons to start the fires and to destroy the crops. So far, 130,000 hectares of wheat and 180,000 hectares of barley have been burned, and the fires are continuing. If we look at, I don't know if you have the map available that we made, but you'll come to it later probably. But it's basically from the south to the northwest to the northeast, and even centrally close to Homs, northern Hama. We're seeing these fires erupting. Now, of course, this has been a pattern of the US coalition occupation of Syria. We've seen not only the burning of the crops, we've seen the stealing or the theft of, for example, cotton, of olive trees. We've seen the decimation of the traditional Syrian olive harvest, both for oil and olives themselves. They were the fourth largest producer in the world. Now half of their olive sectors are occupied by these US coalition terrorist groups. And so therefore what we're seeing is not only the attempt to push Syria into a deliberate state of food insecurity to, of course, force the regime change that militarily the US coalition has failed to do. But also what we're seeing is a sort of mafia operation where these criminal gangs, these terrorist groups, including ISIS, including Al-Qaeda, including the Kurdish Contras, the SDF, are using these products as revenue. So we have the oil, we have the cotton, we have the wheat, we have the barley. SDF, for example, is selling the wheat and the barley to Turkey for Turkish currency. It's not allowing the farmers to sell the products to Syria, to Damascus. So the SDF is participating in this basic blockade and starvation and siege warfare against the Syrian people, as are, of course, Al Qaeda and ISIS. That goes without saying. But what we are seeing is an absolute criminal blockade of every facet of Syrian society in an attempt to basically push them into the abyss of food insecurity and starvation and to deprive them of all of their own natural resources. I mean, even down to the fact that sheep are being stolen, indigenous sheep are being stolen, beehives are being stolen. As I said, the olive trees are being decimated. They're either being used as firewood or, as I say, the areas that are occupied, the terrorists themselves are producing and using the product for revenue.
Yeah, look, I'm going to apologise. I don't have that map. I haven't put it in, but which is unfortunate because one of the things that the map shows is that you've got the United States influence in the northeast, as you said. You've got Turkey in the northwest. You've got Israel messing about in the southwest. And we're going to come on to that in a second. Yes, we're going to come on to that in a second. But what is going on with is there an effort to balkanize Syria at the moment? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I mean, I compare it quite often to Palestine because what we're actually seeing now is an encircling of the area which is effectively under the protection and the control of the Syrian government, the Syrian army and allies. The northwest is occupied and annexed by Turkey, the northeast occupied and annexed by the US coalition and its proxies, which include ISIS and the SDF. In the south, now, what is interesting here, of course, we know that Israel takes 30% of its water supply from the illegally annexed Golan Heights, or the Golan territories, because it includes other territories, not only the heights. But what is interesting is in March of this year, an SAS operative was airlifted out of the south of Syria, having been injured by an IED explosion. Now, we know in the west of Daraa, which of course is where the alleged revolution started, we've seen the resurgence of the armed groups, particularly Al Qaeda and ISIS. And we suspect that it is British military that are effectively training and equipping and working with these groups to carry out what we would call the swarm strategy against the Syrian people, i.e. small localized attacks. For example, there was an attack on a military bus about a week ago now, where I think there were at least 8 martyrs among the Syrian army soldiers who were aboard the bus, and more than 30 injured. And so what we're seeing are these clandestine activities, which we have to suspect are being managed by British intelligence as opposed to, or maybe in conjunction, of course, with Israeli intelligence. And then to the southeast, you have Rukban, euphemistically called refugee camp, which is a recruitment center for Al Qaeda and ISIS under the protection of the US military base at Al Tanaf, which is just to the north of Rukban. And we know that weapons and equipment are coming in from Jordan to supply the terrorist factions that are being trained and recruited inside Rukban. And then they are carrying out isolated and sporadic attacks to the east of Homs, to the east of the Euphrates, and so on. So we're seeing this very concerted, as you say, this very concerted attempt to balkanize Syria, to basically attempt to eventually create a Syria which is surrounded, completely surrounded by enemy hostile occupying forces. And I think this is a huge danger. And I think the Caesar law, which of course now is being expanded and will be extended. Of course, it's completely criminal and fraudulent in itself. I totally recommend everyone to read Rick Sterling's investigation into the actual veracity of the Caesar report upon which this law has been based. And so what we're seeing now is this encircling of central Syria and this attempt to absolutely blockade all of Syria. Of course, with COVID-19, we've seen the weaponization of COVID-19 in order to close all borders to Syria. And then, of course, that has then brought in the Caesar law, which has then further increased the maximum pressure against Syria. So in my view, yes, we are going to see an increase in pressure upon the Syrian people. However, I do have to say that I'm always astounded by their resilience, their resourcefulness, in their resistance against all the measures imposed upon them by the US, including, I mean, even locally, we have a Facebook page where people who have excess medicines are posting what they have available so people can come and pick them up for nothing. That's just a small element of the kind of resistance that the Syrian people will put up against this kind of criminal activity by the US coalition. But how on earth the US can claim that the Caesar law is there to protect Syrian citizens when effectively it is ensuring their starvation, their deprivation, their misery, and their poverty?
I think perhaps the word citizen and terrorist are interchangeable with respect to that. But look, I just want to end with this, Vanessa, because you mentioned the RAF trying to save an SAS soldier wounded in an IED. This has been acknowledged, as you can see on screen there in the Mirror in the UK. But there don't seem to be any questions being asked about what the SAS are doing there in the first place, bearing in mind that the British government has always maintained that there would be no boots on the ground. So I'm just interested to know if you've got any. I mean, you've suggested that there's train and equip going on there, but what sort of scale are we talking about?
That's very difficult to answer. I mean, certainly, I'm surprised nobody has been raising the questions in Parliament, for example. But certainly, what we've seen in the last year is a re-emergence, as I said, of the armed militant factions, particularly to the west of Daraa. We've seen some Syrian army operations against pockets of the militant groups that still remained even after the amnesty and reconciliation. But we're seeing on an almost weekly basis, if not more, assassinations of people who are considered to be government loyalists or who are actually effectively working for the governments. But that includes doctors, dentists, nurses, medical staff who are being assassinated by these armed groups. Now, this type of warfare, this kind of, as I said, sporadic attacks, IED attacks, suicide attacks, isolated assassinations is, of course, very typical of intelligence clandestine operations. And that is very much what I've been told, is that it's this kind of warfare that is now being waged. And of course, the British have a history of this kind of warfare. So the very fact that an SAS operative, he's not going to be operating alone, was airlifted out of the south of Syria. And what was extraordinary when they said, you know, basically this was a war zone. Well, it's not a war zone in theory. The south surrendered. It took amnesty and reconciliation, and the Syrian government is now effectively attempting to reintegrate those armed groups, or the Syrian armed groups, back into society. So what we're seeing are British operatives clearly maintaining incitement of military reaction against the Syrian government and against the Syrian people.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, Vanessa, thank you very much for that. Much appreciated. And we will have you on the programme again very, very soon. Very, very interesting. And we'll keep an eye on what's going on with the continuing attacks on Syria. Thanks, Vanessa. Right now, let's...
It's 20 to 8 on the LBC News Hour. Now, Syria is entering its 10th consecutive year of conflict on top of the COVID-19 pandemic and, of course, an economic collapse. A conference is currently taking place in Brussels, highlighting the desperate humanitarian situation in Syria, as well as supporting the future of the region. David Milliband is President and Chief Executive of the International Rescue Committee and, of course, former Foreign Secretary. He joins me now. He's attended the conference today, albeit virtually. David, very good evening.
Hi,
every time we talk, well, nice to speak to you too. Every time we talk, I think it's usually about Syria. How bad has the situation got since we last talked a few months ago?
The situation on the ground is now quite stable, but it is stable in a very bad place. You hear people say that President Assad has won the war, but what's actually happened is that the country's been divided. 5.5 million refugees have fled Syria. So out of a population of 16 million that are left, 10 million are in areas that are controlled by President Assad and his Russian and Iranian supporters. And about 6 million are split between the northwest of the country, where about 4 million people are. They are people who are trapped between the Turkish border in the north, and they're controlled by a series of rebel groups, some of them affiliated with Al-Qaeda. And then in the northeast of the country, you've got another 2.5, maybe even 3 million people, so 7 million in total, who are also outside President Assad's control. And what we know from the work that aid agencies like the International Rescue Committee do is that the political emergency in Syria has created a humanitarian emergency. And so stable in this case means stably dreadful. 9 million people, we've calculated, are hungry in Syria today. 2 million more are at risk. And from the work that we're doing, COVID is only adding to the humanitarian emergency that exists there. So the conference that's taking place in Brussels, but also, if I may say so, the discussions in the United Nations Security Council this week about the renewal of what's called the cross-border resolution, the resolution that allows aid to be transferred from Turkey into Syria and from Iraq into Syria. Those discussions are absolutely crucial to the livelihoods of many millions of people.
So what's the aim of this conference?
Pledge money because the aid groups rely on international support, but it's also the case, ironically, that the Assad regime relies on international support as well. The United Nations works out of Damascus. It has to work with the Assad regime. So for the 9-10 million people who are within the government's control, there's international aid because there's humanitarian emergency facing some of them as well. I think it's a graver situation for those who are out with the remit of President Assad. And so you've got this interesting counterpoint today. You've got the aid decisions being made in Brussels, but you've also got the political negotiations involving the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, including the UK, 10 elected members on top, trying to figure out whether or not the Russians will try and veto again cross-border aid. You'd think it was incredible that at a time of COVID, everyone would agree humanitarian aid is necessary. But in January, before the crisis started, 2 aid crossings from Iraq into Syria were closed. That means there are no crossings in the east of the country going into the northeast of Syria. And the Russians are threatening to veto again. So this is a time when it's not just money that matters. If you can't get the aid across the border, it's not going to be much use.
Because often when you have international crises like this global pandemic, that's actually an opportunity for countries like Russia to come back into the fold of the normal diplomatic community, isn't it? But they seem to be spurning that opportunity.
Well, that's a good point. The Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, said, look, there's a COVID pandemic. For God's sake, let's have ceasefires around the world. And in some places that has been achieved. In Syria, there isn't active conflict, but there are bombing raids in the northwest of the country where President Assad and his Russian supporters are trying to push back what they consider to be rebel-held territory. There have been bombing raids even in the last month, and we've got our teams on the ground who are having to deal with this. This is local staff, the NGOs I'm talking about, like mine. We hire locally in these areas. I think there's a real question here beyond Syria. When we talked last time, actually, it wasn't about Syria, it was about Yemen and about the crisis there. And I said at the time, there's a crisis of global leadership. Of course, I understand that the first responsibility of government is to its own people. And some governments are doing that well, others are mucking it up. But there's also a responsibility to think about a disease like COVID in a global context. And unless we attack the disease globally, we're not going to return to any kind of normality locally. And the Syria example shows you what happens when you have a vacuum at the international level. You get the bombing of hospitals, you get rebel groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda filling the vacuum, you get regional instability from refugees that flow out. And so I think there's a general point here about the way in which we govern a world that is more connected than ever before, that needs to have have a place in the conversation, even while countries, including the UK, and there's a very bad set of lessons from the US, where the coronavirus is in danger of getting out of control in 12 or 15 states, even while governments have to fulfill their first responsibility to their own citizens, if they've got any sense, they've got to think about this globally, not just locally.
David, thank you very much indeed for joining us again. That's David Milliband, the President and Chief Executive of the International Rescue Committee. In a moment, we'll be speaking with Martin Luther King III. It's 7:46.